I'd love to introduce our keynote speaker, Rick Rossow, who will talk about the promise of U.S India partnership. Rick Rossow holds the chair in U.S India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic International Studies. In this role, he helps promote greater business and economic engagement between the two countries, with a unique focus on tracking and engaging Indian states. Rick also leads the India and South Asia practice at the advisory firm McLarty Associates. He has worked on U.S India relations for over a quarter of a century. Rick's earlier work was as an international business executive, as New York life insurance company, and as deputy director of the U.S India Business Council. He has traveled to India well over 100 times in his career. So please join me in welcoming Rick Rossow.
Sorry, this one is for my microphone. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for having me down. Just flew in from Geneva, where I was spending time with a European water company that's thinking, do they go big on India? Is this kind of the moment? And I'd say that's the sort of questions we're getting from a lot of companies right now. So I'll try to touch on the reasons why, both for economic reasons, but also for security reasons, why the partnership makes sense and some reasons why maybe it doesn't. So I'll cover kind of both sides of this during the presentation. But to get things started here, there we go. Jim, I think this kind of hits on the question that you asked in an earlier panel, which didn't quite get covered, but why? Why all this fuss and effort on trying to get the relationship with India in a decent place? And from my perspective, after 25 years of doing this, there's a few reasons why I think it makes sense. First, U.S. companies need markets for exports. We need countries as well that we can make investments into, partners that can actually help re-engineer products and grow business. The business environment in India, it still remains hard. It is devilishly hard to do business in India. And yet it is getting easier over time. Second, as of 2 years ago, India passed China as the most populous nation on earth and will remain so for the rest of eternity. That's it. The answer to the Trivial Pursuit question for the rest of our lifetimes for sure on which country has the largest population is India. And by the end of the century, they'll have double China's population. Partially because China's population is going to cut in half in that period, but India's will continue to grow. By the end of this decade, they'll have the world's third largest economy, and probably by the end of my lifetime, they'll pass the United States as having the largest or second largest, depending on how the China situation unravels. And last, they strongly share our concerns about the dangers of a rising China. Not a lot of other global issues do we have complementarity, but on that one, which is our number one issue, there is a lot of complementarity. The only question is over geography, which I'll touch on in a few minutes. The question I get then, as with this company I was talking to in Europe last week at the board meeting, when is going to be the right time? When will India start to, as Americans sometimes put it, make what we consider more rational decision making? When you start electing leaders that are constantly in support of growth. One of the big challenges, and this kind of gets to those great micro presentations that we just had on the subnational, primary decision making in India, when you think about development trajectory, is done by state governments. Most of the world wakes up and like, what did Modi have for breakfast? It doesn't matter. Indian citizens, if they've got energy, water, healthcare, education, law and order, that is delivered by your state government, not by the national government. National government's big on, just like the United States, on international trade, on national security. But when you think about people's daily lives, India's development trajectory, and will India be a functioning, vibrant, modern economy, that is up to state governments, not to Modi. And at state level, decision making is based on where voters live. And most voters are rural voters with small plots of land, and their touches with government are subsidies to cover their electricity, their water, to buy their grains. So if you're running for office on state governments, working on modernization and development is like number 32 on your list of things to do. Because you want to win an election, just like anybody would. Voters care less about governance infrastructure, subsidy, social welfare. As I'll show you in a couple of minutes though, that's going to change. It's not right away, but somewhere around India's 100th birthday, which comes up in 2047, somewhere around then, the majority of voters across India are going to live in cities. If you're poor in a city right now, your life is tough. You probably have better, decent health care and things if you're poor living in the countryside, because that's what voters are. But that's going to change. City voters will start winning elections in India. Politicians will play to them rather than using cities as basically the piggy banks for funding these subsidies for the rest of the country. Some states will get there faster. I'm just saying 2047, 2045 is national, but some states will get there faster, particularly in the South. And that's when the motivation to accelerate and modernize, I think, really becomes kind of unstoppable. Still a ways away, but some places will get there a little faster. There we go. So I'm going to two slides that I think talk about what I see as the biggest structural challenges that the nation faces. This one is a huge one. When you think about a lot of the policy-making drivers, particularly of the Modi government. You have a lot of people in agriculture producing very little economic output. And you've got relatively few people in services that are producing a lot of India's economic output. And industry, which includes both mining and manufacturing, is somewhere in between. Modi comes to office almost 10 years ago, and he inherits an economy that had a trade deficit that was equal to about 12% of GDP. Ours in the United States is about 3%. And both political parties have kind of abandoned trade because we feel that the trade deficits are too high. India's is sometimes 4 times higher than ours. And so Modi came to office and announced this big Make in India program, trying to bump the number. This, again, is mining and manufacturing. Manufacturing at the time he took office was about 13% of GDP. And he announced the program to build that up to 25% by the year 2025. We're almost there, and India's at 13.5%. It's not working. But there's some signs that maybe there's some green shoots that we can kind of point to. Thanks. So I'll just give you a nod from here on. This is the chart that I mentioned before, too. As urbanization begins to take root, and state governments start catering primarily to urban voters that want the amenities companies need, electricity, water, things like that, to make manufacturing more vibrant. When those things become the reason you get elected, rather than afterthought, then I think things begin to get a whole lot more interesting in terms of India's economic growth and U.S. India economic collaboration. Looking at the relationships that kind of stands right now, there's some reasons I think that we are coming together, and also some reasons that we continue to be pulled in opposite directions. Some of the big convergences, at the top line, are shared concerns about China. And I say that when I think of government-to-government engagements. India faces a multifaceted threat from China, which overlaps with ours and also has differences. Overlaps with ours in the sense that they're concerned about trade deficits, something that we also share. And not just trade deficits, but China's domination of global supply of critical technologies. You've got shared concerns about cyber. India's already taken the stand on banning TikTok and doing some things that I think will happen in the United States. It's just taken us a little while to get there. But then, of course, they face the threat a little bit more directly. The border issues that came up before. But China's real prize is the maritime domain. 70% of China's energy flows go through the Indian Ocean. And keeping that open during wartime is a primary policy imperative for the Chinese government. Why did they poke India at the border again? My view, and I know it's shared with India's intelligence community and others, is because they wanted to take India's eye off the ball of maritime. India was investing heavily in power projection. Aircraft carriers, submarines, air power. And China's seeing that, what's the easiest way to get India's attention off the ball on that? Poking at the border. Because the next time that the Navy, Air Force, and Army show up to talk about acquisitions with the Ministry of Defense, and the Army says, I've got Chinese troops occupying hundreds of square miles, what happens? Who gets the money for the big resource allocations? It's the Army. You've got to do that. You have to do that. And Beijing knows that. It may backfire because, of course, this pressed India into deepening engagement with the United States pretty actively. So, as I think in the short term, Beijing probably thinks they've been pretty successful. But in the long term, maybe less so. We'll see. Other issue, no, sorry, not quite yet. Another issue that I think comes up with where China, India has a little bit different and more concerted, more directed view is on the future of Tibetan Buddhism. Something we're going to deal with very soon, and it's going to be very explosive. Dalai Lama in his late 80s, says that he has a succession plan that will not put power in the hands of Beijing to choose the successor, but nobody knows what that is yet. And when he dies, and whoever pulls that piece of paper out of his pocket, there's going to be a lot of questions and contestations about the future of a religion that might get stamped out that day. And we care about that a little bit. India cares about that a lot. India is battling China over Buddhism across the world right now. Well, at least across Asia. Second convergence, diaspora and students. Look at this room. Quite a few students, I believe, that probably have Indian heritage, if not are Indian themselves. And that's been a terrific bridge between the two countries. Investments are moving in both directions. By the Government of India official numbers, the United States is the third largest investor in India. But that is a laughable joke. Partially it's because India only looks at where the money came from last. And everybody makes their investments in India through Mauritius and Singapore because of preferential tax treaties. The United States is by far the single largest investor in India. And India is a growing investor in the United States, not just in IT services. You know, my home state of Michigan, which is the auto industry, manufacturing, been largely abandoned. The first new auto factory opened up a couple years ago by Mahindra. You're seeing that across the United States. Good news. IT services. When we talk about U.S. India commercial relations, everybody's looking at the shiny new object. A semiconductor fab may go up at some point, and defense and all that. The absolute bedrock of U.S. India commercial relations is IT services. I mean, we think of Indian citizens that wake up every day and their economic livelihood is driven somewhat by this convergence of our two countries. IT services, we did kind of an informal headcount a couple of years ago, and probably 90% of people employed in the U.S. India economic lane in India are in IT services. Companies like IBM that have hundreds of thousands of employees out there. IT services, these are high-end folks, they don't vote, nobody cares too much about them in policy-making circles, but they do drive economic convergence between the two. And English, now this is the most tired opening line, the two largest democracies, English, but English is a really big deal. For those that don't have a lot of senior level engagement with U.S. corporations, they can be pretty native sometimes, right? They think of there's a few examples that are very international at their core, but a lot of them, international is an afterthought. And engaging countries where you can sit down with somebody across the table without a translator and have a business conversation, I can't tell you how important that is. It shouldn't be, you wish it wasn't, but it is. So the English thing gets passed over as one of these opening lines you got to use at every India conference. I'm telling you, it's a huge deal to make Americans that are thinking about making investments, make them more comfortable. Our divergences, domestic trade policy. We both want to see all the jobs come home, and we both have big trade deficits. So both countries, and India more so than the United States, putting up a lot of barriers to imports. Global trade policy, something that my esteemed chair can talk about ad nauseum more than I ever could. Most global security matters, we have divergences, except China. South Asia is kind of an interesting divergence too. India hates the fact that the United States directs a very independent policy towards its own neighborhood. And that today, with the current foreign secretary, I think is becoming ever more visible. And I think what happened in Afghanistan is a proof point that despite many promises of at least consultations and such, and India reads on Twitter that we've opened up negotiations with the Taliban, that is tough to come back from. So a lot of its neighbors, which are running across political challenges, the fact the United States engages them oftentimes without negotiating, without consulting India, is a problem point which I don't know if we're ever going to be able to move past. Pakistan, I think, has been covered to some extent, and India's endemic corruption, which again is a major issue why a lot of U.S. companies don't go deeper into India for their own business interests. Now, that's kind of like the here and the now, the drivers and the things that kind of pull us back a little bit. Now we'll take a look at the future. How might this accelerate over time and fulfill that promise I brought up in the opening slide? The things that might, I think, accelerate this relationship, first and foremost, well, I don't know if I had this in order, approximately in order, I guess, is what I think. But what happens if the PLA Navy continues to escalate its own operations in the Indian Ocean? Today you've got anywhere from 10 to 15 PLA Navy vessels in the Indian Ocean doing exploration, sub-dockings in Sri Lanka as they conduct piracy operations on the African coast. That, more than anything, I think has helped to bring the challenge that China poses in the forefront of a lot of Indians' minds. Second, what if Make in India works? What if India becomes the manufacturing destination, as China has been for the last 20 years? And every US company that's looking to put global manufacturing has to go to India. I'll tell you, from somebody who's seen, in Washington, D.C. policy circles, multiple presidential candidates on the campaign trail saying, we're going to call out China as a currency manipulator. But when companies have such weightage in China, the lobbying pressure that would be there to make sure that we didn't, unhinge the economic relationship with China was an incredible bulwark during some early tough times. And if India can achieve that by becoming an economic destination of that magnitude, it would certainly help to accelerate ties. If the United States follows some small ways to follow India's lead in South Asia, or at least to do a better job of consultation, would be an accelerant. Helping India with global leadership, I think this was prioritized pretty heavily during the Bush administration. How do you find ways to put India on the global stage? That's been downplayed a little bit, mostly because India itself is more focused on rebuilding connections within its own neighborhood. But still, things like the UN Security Council, India prizes that. We'd love to see that happen. And the United States has made some small attempts so far, but would we ever consider doing a trade agreement? That's not a thing for the here and now, because neither government is particularly pro-trade, although India is actually a little more pro-trade than the U.S. administration is. Something that always feels like I'm throwing mud in my friends' eyes when they always consider India the outlier on global trade. Today it's a little bit more the opposite. And if we find ways to once again go back and expand immigration, which we've had higher caps on H-1Bs before and things like that, that'll help a lot too. There are things that can happen that would decelerate the relationship's trajectory. Number one, which is actually happening, India's domestic manufacturing push. You see India putting up a lot of regulations that slow down foreign companies' ability to put product in the market. India's got quality control orders. If you're exporting to India in certain product areas, you need to have an Indian inspector at the point of production to make sure your stuff is meeting Indian quality standards. China is where a lot of production's at, and guess how many registered reviewers the Indian government has in China to look at products? 0. India's got higher customs duties, local manufacturing mandates, and a lot of companies I talk to, some of them are choosing this point to go in and invest in India, and some are saying not for another decade, just because they're so incensed by some of these aggressive pushes to get companies to localize. Different approaches in South Asia, I kind of mentioned that before. Weak coalitions in India. Now, Modi is the best partner at the leader level the United States has had on economic ties and security ties. He's got a lot of warts, which I'll touch on in a minute, but on those two areas, which are fundamental, he is the single best leader India's ever had for cementing the relationship in those two key areas. If the BJP is forced to have a coalition, or if some other coalition happens to win election, those are tough times. India, as I saw during 10 years of the UPA government, and to some extent the Vajpayee government, when you've got a bunch of people with different ministries treating them like they're prime ministers, it is hard for the United States and India to have a substantial meaning relationship that crosses multiple boundaries if there's nobody that's really playing traffic cop. So weak coalitions, no matter who's leading it, can slow down the pace of the relationship at the very least. U.S. expectation of Indian support. This is fundamental. This is the reason India does not want Uncle Sam's embrace. The next time we decide some other country is the global enemy, India doesn't want to be forced into the camp of going to the fort and sitting in a foxhole with American troops as we shoot at somebody that India otherwise likes. We pressure a lot of our friends to do that at different times. India has bowed to U.S. pressure on sanctions in Iran and Venezuela, things like that, which there was some discomfort. But there's limits, and they don't want to be part of that orbit where they feel they have to because of access to U.S. defense technology and things like that. If U.S. elections trigger us to become more inverted, India's religious intolerance, if it reaches a breaking point, it has not reached a breaking point. There are things that I'll point to in a minute that obviously point in that direction, but at the end of the day, this idea of our companies, our Department of Defense, our groups like that, concerned that the steps that have been taken so far, those things haven't changed the trajectory quite yet, but there are steps the Modi government could take, and probably a few policies in draft that he has in his pocket that he might take, that would cause a lot more organizations that are leading U.S. India ties to rethink that. United States sanctions India. Kind of funny to say out loud, isn't it? We did 25 years ago because of nuclear tests. And technically we're supposed to right now because of India buying the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. The same system we sanctioned Turkey over. About the same dollar amount. And India's already well past the trigger point by which we initiated sanctions against Turkey. And we just keep kicking the can down the road rather than taking a decision on this. Everybody says, no, we don't plan to. But until a waiver is offered, or the law is amended somewhat to give India some space, we have that sanctions, plus India has multiple other Russian acquisitions in the queue right now, which could also trigger a review for sanctions. So what happens if we have a change in government at the end of this year? Then suddenly the decision moves to a whole different set of characters. So it's not inconceivable to say that we might do that. One more point there. Indian conglomerates stifle the market. When Modi first came to office 10 years ago, the big business houses had a little bit less access. But you've seen, as soon as Modi started to lose state elections, you know, we think about it as kind of this unstoppable juggernaut. Today, his party controls 12 states. That's down from 14. They had a bad run, 4-year period, where they didn't win single party majority in a single state beyond 2 small states in the Northeast. They are not this unstoppable juggernaut when you look at the state level. And when he started to run across about 8 years ago a series of bad elections at the state level, 2 things happened. A lot of the Hindu nationalist policies you saw the government introduce, Kashmir, the Citizenship Amendment Act, these things all happened at the time he was losing state elections. And you also began to see policymaking tilt towards the conglomerates that fund elections. It's not magic. It's how politics works. You need the money, you need the votes. When you're feeling weak, you go back to the basics. So conglomerates, if he starts feeling weak again, has a bad run, you know, maybe they all of a sudden have a much louder voice in policy making as well. And that can hurt, you know, areas where U.S. companies want to move into. I'll kind of wrap up by talking about my own view in terms of you know, Modi as a leader. There's some stuff when you dig into the data that you know, he sometimes characterized the next Chavez or the next Erdogan or Putin or Xi or something like that. As always, there's a little truth and a little bit of myth to this whole thing. I'll just offer my own kind of views on that since we've got an election coming up and it looks pretty likely we're going to have another 5-year term. Number one, as a centralizing autocrat, mostly false. Mostly false. The narrative sounds compelling and certainly he tries to portray himself that way, but if you look at some of the actual policy-making steps that Modi has done, the most significant thing that Modi has done to change how the country functions is abolishing the Planning Commission. This was the central government's primary tool to beat states into submission to follow the central government's plans. And he abolished it. He set up a think tank instead, NITI Aayog, which has far less policy-making authority. He allows states to take ODA loans on directly. So there's been a lot of devolution of authority to states at a time that his party only controlled about 6 states. This was not just Modi giving power to his acolytes at the state level. He was giving it mostly to opposition parties at the time. You've seen a little bit less devolution of authority of late, so it's not to say that's been consistent across 10 years, but his first couple of years was pretty big. I mentioned already BJP's domination of politics. Yeah, at the national level, they are the kingpins. At the state level, the record's a lot more mixed. Most of what the BJP has won has been at the expense of Congress. India's regional parties are still managing to hold a pretty good fight of their own. His domination of the BJP, anybody heard the term double-engine growth? Invest in a BJP state and you're going to get all the benefits of Delhi and the state working together. Mostly false. You look at some of Modi's big programs, wind power, solar power, the state's business environment, the Jal Jeevan water mission. Opposition states oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes lead in execution of these projects versus BJP states. It's not because like state leaders say no to Modi, they say yes to voters, and if voters don't want to see those things happen, what would Modi rather see happen? You win state election, you carry out his programs. The answer is obvious, you want to win state elections. But this idea that like Modi announces and his states do, no, the data shows that that's not perfect. And India anti-trade, as I mentioned, they've actually shifted to become a lot more pro-trade, signing narrow trade agreements with a growing number of partners. You see less increases in customs duties and some of these protections that we saw before. So they're not yet the world leader on trade integration per se, but in terms of real trade, reducing barriers, they're more pro-trade than the United States is right now. And that's a strange thing to say, but there's a pretty credible case behind that. And a few hard truths, definitely stoking religious tensions, particularly the moments when the party's feeling relatively weak. They need to re-energize the base. Small steps taken so far, as my wife's family in Canada says, nothing that, in my opinion, changes the price of beer in Canada. You know, nothing that has caused, I think, major decisions to be kicked down the cans kicked down the road. But those may come in the future. Crackdown on dissenting voices. Think tanks, press, and others that have negative things to say about the government, right or wrong, have felt all kinds of pressures, and those independent voices are a lot less. And leaning on India's conglomerates. You know, that's become a tricky thing as well. Some benefits to it. You know, some of the outbound investments that India wants to make on strategic infrastructure in the region. A little easier to have those carried out by some of the conglomerates rather than the government's own resources. But you know, it's pretty tough to compete sometimes if you're in areas that these companies have decided they want to succeed in. So anyways, just a little bit of an aside, but you know, since it looks like we're going to have the same Prime Minister around for a little while, I figured I'd offer my own views in terms of you know, what are the truths and myths about concerns about his policy making and his own stance as a partner of the United States. But overall, you know, look, I'm bullish. I'm bullish because you know, some of these underlying factors on urbanization, India's ability to attract investment, and our shared concerns about China, I think those are deep enough where we're going to be able to suffer some pretty rocky roads here and there. But you never know. Just a decade ago, the relationship fell apart completely. 11 years ago. A series of trade things, we downgraded India's airports regulator, and then we arrested a diplomat up in New York. That was all it took to where India was removing security barriers around the U.S. Embassy. Just 10 years ago. So we're on a pretty good track. I think getting more senior U.S. officials that see the bright side of this relationship and work on it day in and day out, that's still kind of lacking. It's usually a couple of champions at senior levels that really carry the water on this. Luckily, we've had that for successive administrations. But there's a lot more I think both sides can do to try to fulfill this promise. But again, I think a lot of the underlying drivers are going to be there no matter who wins on whichever side. So thanks a lot for listening.